Kenya is this week hosting the inaugural Africa Climate Summit with the goal of increasing commitments and pledges to support climate adaptation efforts and to scale up renewable energy on the continent. However, despite commitments that were made under the Paris Agreement, the current level of climate financing falls far short of what is needed. Here's CGTN's Najma Abdurazak with those details.
African nations, particularly those vulnerable to the impact of climate change, are grappling with the challenge of securing adequate financial support to implement adaptation and mitigation measures. Expectedly during the inaugural Africa Climate Summit, several African leaders highlighted the urgent need for increased climate financing to bridge the continent's funding gap.
The leaders I meet, particularly in Africa, express their desire to get to net zero earlier. But they all say finance is missing. We need more money. We need what's known as concessionary funding. Why do we need concessionary funding? Because that money will behave differently from those trillions that come from large financial institutions, where they have a fiduciary responsibility to produce a profit for the owners of that money. But we still want that money to deploy. So we have to take the risk. You heard earlier about risk. You have to reduce the risk that an investor looks at and sees and says, I'm not going to do that.
To meet the emissions targets set by the Paris Climate Agreement, Africa will need $2.8 trillion by 2030, roughly equal to 93% of the continent's GDP. But with the continent's combined public debt reaching $1.8 trillion in 2022, many African countries lack the fiscal space to mobilize domestic resources.
We'll be putting our heads together to discuss how to build resilience to climate risks, transition to a low-emission economy, and collaborate on solutions, transforming our economies through a just transition that benefits all sectors of society. Africa, the equal partner in this endeavor, is offering its huge potential.
Calls on governments, the private sector and multilateral lenders to begin removing the systemic barriers to investment and development in African countries were also loud at the summit. It's one key area of discussion where leaders are expected to renew their calls to wealthier nations to fulfill their pledges and commitments to providing financial support to African nations in their climate resilience efforts. Najma Abdurazak, CGTN, Nairobi.